Jonathan was breathing hard, his fists still clenched as he stared at David. The night air was cold against his skin, but his blood was still running too hot from the fight, from the adrenaline, from the frustration of standing here. Yet again, face to face with the one man he couldn't seem to escape. David, in contrast, looked completely composed, unbothered, like he hadn't just watched Jonathan fight for his life, like he hadn't just stopped a group of men with nothing but his presence. Jonathan hated that. "Come with me," David said again, his voice smooth, his tone calm, but not a request. Jonathan exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Why?" David stepped closer, his gaze never leaving Jonathan's. "Because whether you like it or not, you're part of my world now." Jonathan let out a bitter laugh. "I never asked to be." David tilted his head. "And yet, here we are." Jonathan wanted to argue, wanted to say that he could handle himself, that he didn't need David's protection. But the truth was glaringly obvious. Tonight had been a warning. And whoever had sent those men wasn't going to stop. David must have seen the hesitation in his expression because his voice softened, just a little. "Jonathan." Jonathan's jaw tightened. He hated the way David said his name, like it meant something. "Fine," Jonathan muttered. "But this doesn't mean anything." David smiled, slow and knowing. "Of course not." Jonathan clenched his fists. He already regretted this. And yet, when David turned and motioned for him to follow, he did. David's car was waiting at the curb, sleek and black, an extension of the man himself. Elegant, powerful, dangerous. Jonathan hesitated before getting in, but David only opened the door and gave him a look. "You're not going to stand in the cold all night, are you?" Jonathan sighed and slid into the passenger seat. David got in beside him, and the car pulled smoothly onto the road. For a while, neither of them spoke. Jonathan stared out the window, the city lights passing in a blur. He could feel David watching him, studying him, but he refused to look back. Finally, David broke the silence. "You have no idea who those men were, do you?" Jonathan shook his head. "If I did, I would have dealt with them myself." David hummed, clearly not convinced. "They weren't just thugs. They belonged to a rival family, someone with a personal interest in seeing you dead." Jonathan frowned. "That doesn't make sense. I'm nothing to them." David's lips curled into something almost amused. "Oh, Jonathan, you still don't see it, do you?" Jonathan's patience was wearing thin. "Then tell me." David leaned back against the seat, watching him like a man enjoying a secret only he understood. "You refused my offer. You walked away from power, from wealth, from everything men like them would kill for. That makes you an anomaly." "So what?" Jonathan scoffed. "That makes me a threat?" David's gaze darkened. "Number, that makes you mine." Jonathan's breath hitched. His fingers curled against his knees, his body going rigid at the weight of those words. "I don't belong to you." David smiled, slow and dangerous. "We'll see." Jonathan turned away, staring out the window again. He should have walked away. But now he wasn't sure if David would ever let him. The drive was too quiet. Jonathan could feel David's gaze on him, even though he refused to look back. The weight of the older man's presence filled the space between them, thick and suffocating, like a hand at his throat that hadn't quite tightened its grip. Yet. "Where are we going?" Jonathan finally asked, his voice rough. David's lips curled at the question, as if amused that Jonathan was only now realizing he wasn't in control. "Somewhere safe." Jonathan exhaled sharply. "I didn't ask for protection," David finished smoothly. "No, you didn't. But you need it, whether you like it or not." Jonathan clenched his fists. "And you think I need it from you?" David turned his head slightly, watching him with that same unreadable expression. "Yes." Jonathan hated how steady his voice was, how effortlessly he made it sound like an undeniable truth. He wanted to argue, to say that he didn't need anyone, but the bruises on his ribs, the dried blood at the corner of his mouth, told a different story. Still, he wasn't going to make this easy for David. "And what do you get out of this?" Jonathan asked, his voice edged with suspicion. "You don't do anything unless there's something in it for you." David chuckled, low and deep. "I get to keep you breathing. And I rather like you breathing, Jonathan." Jonathan's throat tightened. There was something dangerous in the way David said his name, something almost possessive. The car slowed, then turned sharply onto a private road lined with tall iron gates. Jonathan's stomach twisted. "Where the hell are we?" David didn't answer immediately. He let the car pull through the gates, up a long driveway, before finally coming to a stop in front of a house that was less of a home and more of a fortress. Large, secluded, imposing. A place where people disappeared. Jonathan turned to David, his pulse picking up. "No." David arched a brow. "No? I'm not staying here." David sighed, rubbing his temple as if dealing with a particularly stubborn child. "Jonathan, I just pulled you out of an ambush. You think they won't try again? You think they don't already know where you live?" Jonathan's jaw tightened, but he had no response. Because David was right. "One night," Jonathan finally muttered, looking away. "That's it." David's lips twitched, amusement flickering behind his eyes. "Of course." Jonathan didn't trust him for a second. And yet, when David opened his door and motioned for him to step inside, he followed. Just for one night. That's what he told himself. But even as he crossed the threshold, deep down, he already knew. David Taylor wasn't going to let him go so easily. Jonathan stepped inside, his body tense, his instincts screaming at him to turn around and leave. The house was exactly what he expected. Expensive, calculated, and cold. No personal touches, no warmth. Just a place built for power. It suited David perfectly. The door shut behind him with a quiet click, and he felt it like a lock snapping into place. "Relax," David murmured, stepping past him, his presence annoyingly effortless. "You look like you're walking into a prison." Jonathan's gaze flicked toward him. "Aren't I?" David only smirked. "Depends on whether you plan on leaving." Jonathan clenched his jaw. He wouldn't let himself react to that. "Where am I staying?" he asked instead. David motioned toward the grand staircase leading up to the second floor. "Guest room, end of the hall. Clean sheets, hot shower, everything you need." Jonathan studied him for a long moment. "And you?" David tilted his head slightly, amusement flickering in his gaze. "Are you asking where I'm sleeping, Jonathan?" Jonathan exhaled sharply. "I just want to know if I should expect you to stand outside my door all night." David chuckled, and damn it, the sound was almost fond. Tempting, but no. He took a slow step closer, his voice dipping lower. "Though if you'd prefer company..." Jonathan turned and walked away before David could finish the thought. He ignored the soft laughter behind him as he climbed the stairs. The guest room was exactly what he expected. Perfect, untouched, like no one had ever stayed in it before. The bed was too large, the sheets too smooth, the air too still. Jonathan took a long, slow breath, running a hand down his face. What the hell was he doing here? He should have walked away. He should have never stepped into David's world like this. But the memory of the attack in the alley still burned in the back of his mind. The feeling of fists slamming into his ribs, the sharp glint of a blade too close to his throat. David had saved him. And that was the problem. Because now, whether he wanted to admit it or not, Jonathan owed him. And David Taylor didn't let debts go unpaid. Hours later, Jonathan still couldn't sleep. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, trying to pretend he wasn't hyper-aware of where he was. The silence of the house was different from the noise of the city. It pressed in around him, made him feel like a caged animal. Then, footsteps. Slow. Measured. Jonathan tensed. The sound stopped outside his door. He waited. Seconds stretched into minutes, but nothing happened. No knock, no voice. Just the quiet presence of someone standing there. Then, just as silently as it had come, the presence faded. The footsteps retreated down the hall. Jonathan let out a slow breath, his fingers curling into the sheets. David had never intended to sleep. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. And that was the part that should have scared Jonathan. But it didn't. It just made him wonder how long he could keep pretending he didn't want to open that door.